This session is another talk on social networks, this time on misinformation, persuasion, and news media by Chin-Chia Hsu.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be here and meet you all at Simon's Institute. Today, I'm going to quick introduce myself and my PhD work on misinformation, persuasion, and news media on social networks. This thesis investigates people's behavior of news consumption in an environment with real and false information. Okay, it's about me. I obtained my PhD at MIT. So my current research interests lie in game theory, strategic communication, design for social system, and HCI on platforms. And I'm currently a postdoc at Microsoft and also a program research fellow in the Grab Limits program. So with the advent of social media platforms, online news business is boosted. And according to a survey that 70% of adult Americans consume news via social media, they inattentively receive information on the platform, they share digital contents, and sometimes they actively attend to some news media on social platforms for information that is not easily accessible to the public, such as the war in Ukraine. So I will talk about more details about these three parts. So there is a lot of information on social media, but turns out like much information are false or inaccurate. So Ellicott and Gansko present some evidence about the exposure to fake news prior to the 2016 election. And Persuasion et al. In 2018, they empirically showed that false news tend to spread wider than real news on Twitter. And Joe Uganda find that no structural difference in news spread can be largely explained by the transmission rate of news between peers. That is to say that it seems like people tend to share false news with higher probability than real news. So what is the motivation behind the news sharing? So the New York Times actually point out some possible reasons. So sometimes we want to inform others, we want to provide some content, identify ourselves to some group, to strengthen relationships, feel engaged in the discussion. But here I use another angle that people share information because they want to persuade others. They want to change others' beliefs so that their actions can be aligned with my objective. So here I cut these problems to the angles of strategic communication. And about the news media, what roles are they playing? So the book 11 Elements of Journalism point out some principles, like you should report the truth, you should verify, and the news media should be independent from other bias. But I think we already very familiar with this, that news media are usually biased with their own political agenda. And Gansko et al. Actually point out two major ways that news media bias their report. So sometimes they ignore the event, they don't want to disclose to you the information, or sometimes they just briefly, over a very high level picture about the events without providing details to you. Moreover, Michel et al. Showed that news consumers tend to choose the news media with the same ideology. So I think people here are very familiar with the term that I code it as homophily. So you want to attend to the news media with the online ideology. So here we see these two phenomena. First is false news triggers a larger cascade. And what is and why and how misinformation spread wider? So what is the role of news credibility in news sharing, and how is it related to population characteristics? Another problem is about the homophily we observe in news media outlet market. So why people choose a line ideology, and what are the concerns when they select the news media for news, and how maybe the extremists and centrists make the different choices, and how we rationalize these choices. So I cut through these two problems using a game-theoretic framework. So in my models, I say, oh, what if people are rational and strategic, and their main motive for sharing and disclosing news is to persuade others. So here I propose the following framework. Is a general framework for 2 of my papers. So I consider a large population of agents with heterogeneous individual beliefs on some underlying state of the world. And then people have this preference for the alignment of others' action with my own belief. So I want you to take the action that I think is right. So I persuade by feeding others new information. So I use information to change your belief about the state. And in the end, people need to take a binary action like the election. So we represent the 2 ideological wings. So I will briefly talk about the models, the 2 models I have. I won't provide too many technical details, but give you a very broad picture of my models. So my first work is with Amir and my advisor Ali. So again, so this is a large population and people have their own individual heterogeneous belief. This is their private information, but we assume that there is a common knowledge that I know the distribution of people's belief, but I don't directly observe people's belief on the state. So here I consider this news that is a real number. And then I use this term credibility beta between 0 to 1 to measure the credibility of the news. And what does it mean? Let's see. So the 1 means fully credible and 0 means that this news is without any information. So what is the expectation on the state? If you haven't received any news, you just preserve your prior belief on the state, mu I. But if you receive the news, you do the convex combination between the news and your prior belief using this credibility of the news. So you see that if the news is fully credible, then you totally believe the state is the news value. So this is a broad picture, the timeline of my model. So people are connected via the Reddit social networks. There's a follower network. And then I use the random network model. I think people are familiar with this, and with the Poisson degree distribution. And then when some agents see the news, they decide whether to share or not. And they strategically thinking like they need to influence their followers' belief, but they also consider, okay, my followers may receive the news from others. So there is a strategic concern here. I won't detail the strategic concern here. And then eventually people just, they choose whether left or right. So these are the main results of our paper. So basically we characterize this news thread that is endogenous at equilibrium. And then we show that when network is sufficiently dense, like very connected, then less credible news can spread wider than fully credible news. So basically there's a limit on the network connectedness, like beyond which the less credible news can spread wider. And then we further show that, okay, if we consider a population with a polarized opinions, then we see that the strong polarization can actually decrease the limit, meaning that the less credible news can spread wide in a wide range of networks. But when we consider this perspective diversity, it can actually have a non-monotone effect on this limit. So people would say the conventional wisdom would be like, oh, if you increase the diversity, you can help inhibit the spread of misinformation. But here we show that it is not necessarily correct. I think I kind of run out of time. I will be very quick. So let me just jump into this subscription model. So basically, people want to choose the left or right. And then there is some news. It can actually be false. And then it will be passed to the news media. So the Fox News or CNN may receive the news or not. And then if they do receive the news, they first decide whether to verify at some cost. And then they decide, okay, should I disclose this information to my readers or not? And then subscribers will update their beliefs and take the action based on whether they see the news. If they receive the news, they just update. If they don't receive the news, they also need to strategically think, okay, maybe the Fox News or CNN conceal the news from me. And then there is also updating process here. So let me give you a very interesting result. We actually showed that the centrists have this anti-homophily behavior, meaning that if I'm the right Republican, but I'm a centrist, then I will actually seek the information from the left-leaning part, because I'm afraid of some information that is useful for me, but the Fox News will sometimes conceal some left-leaning news from me, but I think that is useful for me. But the left-leaning part will reveal that information. So that's why I have this concern, and I will seek information from left-leaning part. But interestingly, that the extremists will actually have this homophily behavior because they kind of have the aligned objective with the aligned news media, because if I'm an extremist Republican, I know that only the very true news, but that is left-leaning, will change my decision. And also that will change Fox News decision. Fox News will definitely verify that kind of information for me. So this is like when the extremists have the aligned objectives, so they seek the information from aligned news media. So this is some research directions that can be extended based on my thesis work. But recently, I'm very interested in hybrid work, so I'm happy to discuss any collaboration in this new area. Yeah, thank you so much.
Great. Thanks for the talk. Any questions?
Thank you for the talk. Very nice. I was wondering if you have done any testings against the real data you collected on social platforms, or if so, then can you comment on how? Give a few comments on how that's set up.
Yeah, good. Yeah. So here, my thesis work is like purely theoretical, and then my advisor, my PhD advisor did have some thought about should we run the experiments, because I think to test this model, we need to run the experiment instead of using the existent data to validate it. Yeah, but I'm open to that direction. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Do you find that there is an asymmetry? In other words, does one side prefer more outrageous news than the other side, or the more unbelievable news? And how does that affect your statistics?
So let me clarify the question. So you mean that I find theoretical evidence that people want to find extremist information?
Well, the stranger, more outrageous news, does it tend to go to one side, preferred by one side versus the other?
I'm not sure if I understand correctly, but here in my model, I actually have this. Actually, there is a variation here that we show that if you see some extreme news that is opposite from you, you may think that is likely to be false news. And then you will not update your belief to the opposite side. So here, but when it comes to some opportunity of verification, you will definitely want people to verify the extreme and opposite news for you. But if you just see that news and you think that is likely can be false or true, then you will think, okay, that is false, and I don't believe that news.
Well, I'm getting at is my impression is that the right
Yes.
side of the political spectrum tends to prefer the more outrageous, unbelievable news than the left side, or is that, do you take that into
Yeah, yeah.
account in your data or in your system?
Yes. As I said, so here actually we consider like various belief systems, and in one case is that let's say if I'm a Republican and I see some news that is aligned with my ideology, is ante, I believe that is more likely to be true, and I will buy that information. But if that information is on the left-leaning part, and I will think, okay, just based on my prior belief, I will think that is false news, and I will not buy that information. But here, because I know that news media will still have the option to verify the news, so I will rely on that verification for me. Otherwise, if there is no verification in this model, there is some possibility that as a Republican, I would just believe the right-leaning news, while I don't buy the left-leaning news because I think that is likely to be false. Yeah, that is. Yeah.
Let's take further questions in the break. So thanks to all the speakers of the session, and we will now have a half-an-hour break and reconvene at 11:30.